Hi class, thank you for joining me again. This Module 4 lecture is about managing your speech anxiety or communication apprehension, as we call it here in public speaking. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I personally struggle with some communication apprehension, and I know that a lot of y'all are probably nervous about speaking publicly. So let's jump in. It's a really great lecture. As always, let's start off with a good definition of communication apprehension. This one was developed by Dr. James Mikrowski and Virginia Richmond. Communication apprehension can be defined by an individual's level of fear or anxiety associated with the real or anticipated communication with another person or persons. So it's all about how nervous or anxious you get when you are experiencing or when you're even thinking about communication happening in the future. Now, Mikrowski and Richmond actually found in 1995 that 20% or 1 in 5 of the general population suffers from higher levels of communication apprehension, as measured by the PRCA, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. That is a significant number. That means that out of this classroom of 25 students, 5 of us will experience higher levels of communication apprehension, almost extreme levels of nervousness when we have to talk in front of people or to people. So that's a big number, and when we think about our peers, we have to be gracious with them. They might be one of those people on the higher end of this spectrum that gets really nervous when they talk to people. There are 4 main types of communication apprehension that we should know, and we'll go over those in the next 4 slides. So the first one is trait-like communication apprehension, and this refers to a relatively enduring personality type orientation toward a given mode of communication across a wide variety of contexts. Now that definition is a little murky, but basically this trait-like apprehension applies to many different contexts. So people with trait-like anxiety, communication apprehension are anxious about communication in a variety of settings, whether it's talking one-on-one to just a friend or a family member, or public speaking. In a small group, they're always sort of a little bit anxious about communicating. The next one is context-based communication apprehension, defined as a relatively enduring personality type orientation toward communication in a given context, usually based on types of communication settings. So for this person, maybe they're fine in a small group communication setting. You know, they're talking, they're directing the group, they're negotiating, they're all fine with that. But once you place them in front of a large group of people, they get really anxious and nervous. This means that it would be based on the context, right? One more great example of context-based communication apprehension would be if someone is great and not nervous at all when they have plenty of time to prepare and rehearse a speech before delivering it. But if they're placed on the spot and they have to do some impromptu speaking, they get really nervous and they start to panic. That's certainly the case for me. Next, we have audience-based communication apprehension. Again, it's a relatively enduring orientation toward communicating, but this one is with a given person or a group of people. So, for example, you are delivering a speech at a wedding, and your entire family is there, a bunch of your friends are there, and because you're so familiar with the audience, you really don't want to mess up. Or perhaps it's a professional setting and your boss is there in the conference room and you're delivering a presentation that you've worked really hard on. Because your supervisor and your superiors are in that room, that means that you might be more nervous in this specific audience-based context. Our last type of communication apprehension is called situational. This one is more transitory, and it's an orientation toward communication with a given person or group of people, and the response is to situational constraints. So it's kind of hard to define, but this one is more of an amalgamation of the temporal, the socio-physical, just basically the cultural context in which you're delivering a speech or speaking publicly. And so it's more wrapping all of it into one, and that specific situation is what's making you anxious. This next slide talks about the PRCA 24 scores. PRCA is an instrument and it stands for Personal Report of Communication Apprehension. Within this module, you are instructed to download this piece of paper and fill it out and see what your personal report communication apprehension score is. So, if you scored relatively low, then that means you probably don't have much communication apprehension, right? Easy cheesy. You just don't worry much about speaking publicly or speaking with others, communicating in general. And then as we go up, we get to moderately low. If you're somewhere in the middle, moderate, then you get up to moderately high, where you're pretty nervous to speak in front of people. And then if you're scoring within the high range, you have pretty extreme levels of communication apprehension. Now, I'll be honest with you that when I took public speaking my freshman year at Texas Tech, I scored within the high range of my PRCA, and that was really worrisome because I felt that it was a speed bump that I could never get over with public speaking and that I would never be good at public address of any kind. And I scored so high because I have some trait-like communication apprehension. It's why I stumble sometimes, it's why I get a little bit shaky when I speak in front of people, and that's all okay because I've practiced and I've gotten better gradually over the years at addressing people. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you are scoring within this high range of communication apprehension, don't worry, you're not alone, and there is potential for you to get a lot better at this kind of stuff, and more importantly, more comfortable with it. So because you've already filled out the PRCA and figured out your own score and which category you fall into, now you can be more aware of your own communication apprehension and look over that measure and see if you can identify certain situations that make you nervous. If you're more nervous speaking one-on-one, if you're more nervous about addressing a large group of people, this is all to help you be more aware so that you can better conquer these fears. Alright y'all, so a big part of this course, especially for those of us who are a little bit more nervous than most, is trying to speak with confidence. And in order to reach that goal, we first need to reframe our thoughts around our communication apprehension. The first thing is to accept a moderate amount of nervousness. So this includes just sort of sitting with the fact that when we get up to speak publicly, or perhaps even in an everyday conversation, we might be a little bit nervous, and that's totally normal, and it actually might help us in the long run because that's going to propel us to prepare and rehearse as much as we can so that we eliminate some of the guesswork when we actually get up there. So it's often found that the people who are more nervous in a public speaking class do better overall because they're prepared more, because they're a little bit more worried and anxious about it, they generally do better. So with this, we need to focus on our audience and our topic, not on ourselves. So when we become super self-conscious when we're up there speaking, it can be helpful to reframe our thoughts to focus more on what we're saying and who we're saying it to, rather than how we look or how we're coming across. This is a great tip, and it helps to find something that you're really passionate to talk about. Therefore, you'll be less worried about how you look and more worried about trying to frame your subject matter in the best possible way. Next, we should think rationally about our goals. Don't fall into this rabbit hole of thinking that everything needs to be perfect, that everything needs to be spot on in order to deliver a perfect presentation. A perfect presentation can have some stumbles, and it can have, some falters. That's okay. You can still get your message across in a clear and concise and beautiful way. So that brings us to myth number 1. The presentation must be perfect. That's a myth because of what I just said. You don't have to be perfect in every single way in order to deliver a perfect presentation. For myth number 2, you can entertain every listener. The fact is, some people might fall asleep when you're talking, or they might zone out and they might not get your message. But if you can get a few people on your side or have the majority of people listening to you and thinking about what you're saying, that's a win. Third myth is that the worst will happen. It's just statistically impossible that the worst is always going to happen when you're up there. More than likely, you might be a little bit nervous, but overall, you're going to keep going. You're going to get through that presentation, and you're probably going to earn a pretty good grade as long as you're prepared. My next big tip for speaking with confidence is to prepare and practice, of course. So the first one is the first tip within this is to just start working on it. Don't procrastinate on your speech because you're nervous about giving it in the future. It's better to go ahead and start writing it out, start brainstorming and organizing it into an outline. The more you see it on paper or typed out, the better it's going to form in your head and the more confident you'll be once it's actually time to give that speech. Second is to get feedback early, and that can mean coming to my office hours and having me read through an outline. My best students are always the ones who come and let me see what they're working on way before they're actually going to give the speech. Or maybe even get feedback from a friend or a roommate or your parents. If they're good at this kind of stuff, then they'll be able to critique your speech, and you can make those changes long before you give it. The next one, of course, is to practice. This is huge. Practice, 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 and you'll be a lot more prepared on speech day. Of course, you need to practice on your feet and perhaps before a small audience. If you can gather a few people, I know that's tough in the age of coronavirus, but if you can, get a few people together and practice on your feet, standing up, just as you would practice like you play on speech day. Next, you should practice for a conversation rather than a performance. And this means that your delivery should be extemporaneous and more casual rather than a theatrical performance. When we start to think about it too theatrically and performatively, that's when we start to get a little bit more anxious because it's a big dramatic thing. But if you think about it as a conversation where you're going to talk for a while and then eventually get feedback from the receiver or from the audience, then it's a little less nerve-wracking. Just think about it as talking about something you love or are passionate about. Third, practice until you can deliver it without relying on your notes. So as you know, we'll have note cards, little 3x5 or 4x6 note cards before each speech. And these on them have little phrases or words that are checkpoints throughout your speech so that you can look at them briefly and then resume and start talking to the audience again. So these note cards are very important for keeping your place, especially for those of us who get really nervous, but we don't want to be constantly looking down and reading off of our note cards. We want to glance down at our note cards and then back up at the audience in order to speak with confidence. Here are a few recommendations for speaking with confidence on speech day. So first things first, to get a good night of sleep before and have a good breakfast the morning of your speech day. This can seem trite, like it's not going to affect anything, but it really is. So don't procrastinate and stay up until 3 in the morning on the night before your speech. That's a really bad idea, and the audience is going to be able to tell you're tired, and with that tiredness is going to come even more adrenaline and scaredness and nervousness, right? Make sure to eat a healthy, nutritious breakfast, just like before a standardized test or something like that. Try to move a bit before speaking, if that means some stretching or yoga, maybe even a brisk walk down the hallway, just to get the blood pumping a little bit. I find that that helps a whole lot before I speak. Avoid caffeine or carbonation and alcohol and really any other substance that is going to alter your state of mind, of course. We don't want to put that kind of stuff into our body before we speak because, again, it can amplify the nervousness that we feel naturally. You're already going to have a lot of adrenaline pumping through you, and I promise you that will fuel you through your presentation. Next, we want to dress professionally. we know that when we dress better, we test better, and also we perform better, usually in speeches. So if you feel confident in the way you look and the way you're presenting yourself to the audience, you're automatically going to do well on your speech. Lastly, visualize and speak positively to yourself. So you might know visualization as a method that athletes use when they're about to go into a big game. Maybe a baseball player pictures hitting a home run, and then maybe he does in the ball game, or maybe he even gets a base hit. Maybe a basketball player imagines himself slam dunking the ball, and maybe he does in the game. Or maybe he just plays better. It doesn't matter if your visualization turns out exactly as you pictured it in your head, but visualizing success usually leads to some form of success. And speaking positively to yourself, you probably know this about emotional self-care. It's important to have positive thoughts about the upcoming speech in your head, and saying nice things to yourself can really improve your self-esteem when you're going into a speech delivery. Okay, everyone, that's the end of our Module 4 lecture over communication apprehension or managing your speech anxiety. I hope it helped you a little bit. Make sure to ask me any questions if you still have them, and I look forward to seeing you. Bye.